on behalf of Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Center at the University of Houston Law Center. We are delighted to welcome you today for our Environmental Law and Energy Law and Policy webinar. And we appreciate your time engaging as we examine one of the rapidly evolving and consequential topics in energy governance. So we are honored to join by two distinguished scholars. Firstly, Professor Heather Payne, Kissell Professor in Law at the Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. Professor Payne brings an interdisciplinary background that includes chemical engineering, corporate leadership, and extensive work in environmental energy regulation. Her scholarship focused on regulatory design, energy transition, and environmental governance, with the publication in the leading law review journals such as UC Irvine, UCLA, and Florida. Prior joining Ohio State, she served as a faculty at Seton Hall, and she was assistant director for the Center for Environment, Energy, Environment, and Economics at the University of North Carolina School of Law. We are also equally pleased to welcome Professor Joel Eisen, Robert Merhige Faculty Research Scholar and Professor of Law at the University of Richmond School of Law, a nationally recognized authority on energy law, environmental law, and administrative law. Professor Eisen, as probably most of you know, that he's an author and the co-author for major books, and including a major text or case book, which is Energy, Economics, and Environment. His article also appeared in top journals across the nation, and his work has received several major academic honors, including University of Richmond Distinguished Scholar Award. His extensive experience includes law practice, public sector service, and more than 3 decades of teaching research on electricity regulation and renewable energy policy. So in today's topic, we are discussing artificial intelligence and energy democracy. They also explore how emerging AI tools may reshape participation in public utility commission proceedings and address a long-standing and injustice in access in the electricity. By reducing technical barriers and expanding artificial capacity for the public AI, they argue that AI has a potential for deepening democracy and public engagement. So thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and we are delighted to start our webinar. And we have 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of the discussion. And I will share the CLE credit immediately after the talk. So please welcome to our distinguished scholars, and let's talk about our discussion.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and we are very excited to be here and to share our thoughts and our recent scholarship with all of you. In the chat, the first thing I am doing is I'm actually going to post a link to the article. So if any of you are interested in going ahead and reading further, because obviously we're not going to be able to get through absolutely everything that we talk about in the paper today, please go ahead, go to that link, and you can download it there. And I think, one of the things that we, as everybody who is working around energy right now, really need to do is recognize just how much artificial intelligence is having an impact on our grid. For those of everybody like not cutting edge on all of this, right? Bloomberg NEF actually came out yesterday with a new forecast that was 36% higher for data center demand in 2035 than the one that they had just put out 7 months ago. So it's well recognized at this point that artificial intelligence and the electricity necessary for AI really is fundamentally reshaping our grid. With that, obviously, comes a lot of discussion around really what does that look like? Is that having an impact on reliability? Is it going to fundamentally reshape the resources that we are either maintaining on the grid, putting on the grid? What does that look like? And there's a lot of scholars out there that are having that conversation and discussing really what this means for the grid itself. That is not this paper. We acknowledge that those conversations are happening. We acknowledge that, yes, that is a conversation that has to happen. But what we wanted to do was really say, okay, how could the development of artificial intelligence tools really end up being beneficial for our grid and for the participants of our grid ecosystem? And that's really what this paper is focused on. And one of the things that also we need to recognize is that AI and various other tools are already being used within the grid ecosystem. So utilities are using various tools. And what we found as we were really looking at those use cases is that the places where artificial intelligence is interacting with our grid today is where it can benefit utilities and other corporate actors in our grid ecosystem. So things like making it so customers don't actually talk to a real person at a call center, operational impacts that can be mitigated on the utility operation side. But at the same time, we don't have tools that are being implemented at this point in time to really make the governance of our grid more accessible and more easily understood to the majority of participants that maybe would like to participate in grid governance, but really don't have the knowledge, don't have any way to do that. And so we actually were looking to say, acknowledging that we want to use AI for beneficial purposes on our grid, what actually would that look like? What would we have to do? And going through, again, current uses where it's not being used, we really figured out that what we would need to do would be to empower citizens, empower the people who are not typically involved in the regulatory process in a way where they could both understand and have an impact on those decisions that were being made by regulators. And obviously, the University of Houston is the one that is hosting us for this. We recognize that that's going to look a little different in Texas than it would in most places in the country. And even everywhere else in the country, right? It's not going to necessarily be the same process. So obviously, this is going to have a different flavor state by state, whether you're in a restructured state, whether you're in a traditionally vertically integrated state. It's going to look different. But at the same time, there are some commonalities. And really, one of those commonalities is the fact that we do tend to see different decisions when interveners are present in regulatory dockets and regulatory processes, right? We see regulators actually taking what they say into consideration and potentially ending up at a place that is arguably better for the rate-paying public than it would have been had those interveners not been there. And of course, the challenge is that in most states, intervener compensation doesn't exist. Even where it does exist, it is highly inadequate. And there are a lot of other limitations that exist for interveners. And so what we really tried to do is to say, okay, given the limitations, right? Time, money, information asymmetries, access to data, access to things like computer models. Really, what actually could we use AI for that would make it so that interveners had a better chance of wholly and fully participating in rate setting and other utility proceedings. And of course, one of the major issues is that we do have these really substantial barriers to participation. And a lot of that comes from very well documented issues. We know that it is very difficult for ratepayers to get access to the information that they need to have to fully participate. And in the paper, one of the examples that we use is a traditional rate case. And we basically look at how oftentimes the utility is putting forward cost and revenue assumptions, and it is incredibly difficult for interveners to actually go ahead and attempt to refute some of those assumptions within the regulatory process. And obviously, one of the main things that has to happen in order for there to be more transparency is we need to deal with the confidentiality issues. But even, aside from that, it's almost impossible for someone who is not well versed in utility rate making proceedings to understand any of the information that is being provided in a typical rate proceeding. And we actually think that artificial intelligence could benefit interveners and ordinary citizens in understanding really what is going on, what the utility is asking for, what that is based on, and then actually using all of that information to go ahead and propose alternatives, both within the rate case, so whether everything is justified adequately, whether it's gold plating, whatever it might be, to actually make it so that those concerns are addressed by the regulator, and there actually is another voice that's in the room rather than just the regulators hearing from the utilities themselves. Joel, do you have anything to add on that one?
Sure. Let me jump in and talk a little bit about the proceedings that we're analyzing here. Before I do any of that, I have two bits of housekeeping to take care of. First, I want to acknowledge Dr. Hassan mentioned the energy law casebook that I have been a co-author for many years. And I see that Professor Jacqueline Reaver is with us today, and she was a co-author on the book for many years. She knows more about oil and gas regulation than anybody I have ever met. And it was it was my pleasure to be a co-author of hers for 2 decades. The second thing I wanted to say was this is not my first time at the University of Houston. Of course, I'm virtual today. The last time I was there, I was in a energy regulation symposium where I wound up writing a law review article in the symposium issue and was the first law professor to use the term virtual power plant in a law review article. That was some years ago. I remember very fondly the symposium, and of course, I remember this, and I say this because it has a connection to what we're talking about here today. Let's just assume for the moment, I'm gonna flesh out some of what Heather said in terms of how you might approach going about trying to learn about a utility's proposal to charge you more money and how to vet the proposals, everything Heather has said, but think about it as if you were approaching it from the perspective of an individual. So first, you would go and look at the website of a state utility commission. In Virginia, it's the State Corporation Commission. And you would see a very counterintuitive menu that would talk about energy regulation, but eventually might take you to some dockets. And I don't know if everybody on this call is familiar with what a docket looks like in a Public Utility Commission proceeding, but they are dense and impenetrable. And one thing that animated our thoughts when we started thinking about this project was where can AI be the most beneficial? And as Heather said, we decided that the place it could be most beneficial was where individual ratepayers, people who pay for electricity, wanted to intervene, take part in Public Utility Commission proceedings. There are barriers to intervener participation. Heather mentioned compensation, but another one is that a commission need not grant you the right to intervene. There are statutes in many states that allow the commission to exercise some discretion because it has discretion over who takes part in its proceeding about whether to let you in. And so if you were to write to a public utility commission and say, look, my name is Heather Payne, and I'm very concerned that Dominion Energy in Virginia wants to charge me 12% more money for my electricity, and I want to be part of the proceeding that evaluates that 12%, that application for the 12% increase. Well, first of all, you'd have to know, you would have had to gone to the website and you would have to know that the way this is done is through this proceeding that Heather mentioned called a rate case. And then you would have to know that it was this particular proceeding, and then you would have to know something about the proceeding that would be more than just your interest. It would be more than just you're here and you're concerned that you're going to pay 12% more. Instead, the commission would be looking for you to have a certain amount of specialized expertise about what the proceeding might be about. And this is written, this is codified in many states in the intervenor statutes. Well, one thing we recognized right away was that AI could help you get over that barrier. You could use an AI model to learn about what a proceeding was about, learn what the utility was proposing to do, and then at that point, make a more thoughtful and sophisticated application to be an intervener. Now, that sounds a little bit far-fetched, I suppose, and we have said in other workshops that it's probably likely that the people who would make use of this in the first instance are going to be those who already have some expertise intervening in PUC proceedings. I've been at a number of workshops talking about this paper, and environmental groups that are used to practicing and intervening before public utility commissions said to me, "Oh, we could definitely make use of this." But we see it as, in the end, likely to extend beyond that to ordinary people, to people who want to learn what their public utility commission is doing and possibly do something about it. So the first place where we thought it might do some good was actually getting over that barrier to get you into the proceeding. And this is important because in other states, these rate cases are set the electric rates that you're going to pay for years to come. In Virginia, there's actually a statutory requirement now that it be done every 3 years. So that if the commission approves that 12% increase, it's now good for another 3 years. You really want to be part of that proceeding and you want to see what you can do about it. All right. So let's say that you have gotten over the barrier, or you and a group of people have gotten over the barrier to become part of this. Now, we need to take a little bit of a detour here because there is one aspect of this that everybody wants to ask us about and we haven't yet really addressed, and that is, where did the model come from? Where did that AI model come from that enabled you to first become a part of this proceeding? So let's put that question on the back burner for now because it's an important question and we do address it, but it's something that I want to address after I've talked about what AI can do for us. So now you're in the proceeding. One of the things that Heather mentioned was that you can evaluate the utility's proposals. What a good AI model can do is say, if a utility like Dominion wants to build a new natural gas-fired power plant to handle the new demand that it's getting from data center growth, you can evaluate the cost of that plant, not only in terms of what Dominion says it's going to cost, but also by reference to similar projects in other jurisdictions. A good AI model could go look in dockets in other Public Utility Commission proceedings and compare the sort of data that a utility has put forward about what a new power plant would cost with what's being said elsewhere. Heather and I were in a workshop a week ago where we were talking about data availability by public utility commissioners, and we were talking to a number of commissioners from around the nation, and they are learning from each other. They are learning what good data handling practices should be, and we'll have a lot more to say about that here too, because availability of data for training that AI model is going to be super important. And you'll see that the data that we think should be made available is not always made there. So one thing you could do is you could use AI to evaluate the utilities proposals. But one other thing you could do, at least in theory, is you could use AI to say that the utilities proposals for matching supply and demand are not the optimal ones. And here I want to come back to that virtual power plant idea, because you could put forward the idea of having more virtual power plants or something like that, more energy efficiency, as an alternative to building that new natural gas-fired power plant. One thing we say in the article that should be relatively self-evident to you is that the proposal to build the power plant came from the utility. They have no interest in evaluating alternatives other than the one they have in mind. Or if they do so at a relatively limited basis. And we know from previous experience that they don't typically consider the sort of alternatives that I just mentioned, more efficiency, more demand side response flexibility, more virtual power plants. This is not the kind of thing that utilities want to be involved in. And there are lots of reasons for this, not the least of which is they don't get to build anything and make lots of profits on it. So you could use AI to get into a proceeding to evaluate the utility's ideas and possibly to propose some of your own. And let Heather talk some more about the limitations there, and we'll come back and talk about uh, what this model is and how this model gets built.
Yes, so a lot of the limitations, there are multiple, right? So obviously the data is one of the big ones. Anybody who has been part of a utility proceeding knows that a lot of the information is classified as confidential, and that can be very problematic when intervenors are looking to actually go ahead and use this data. The other big limitation on that is obviously for, as Joel mentioned, the AI model to work properly. One of the things that it really needs to be able to do is look across states, look across different proceedings, to be able to evaluate how different states are essentially looking at a similar issue. And if all of that is protected by confidentiality and behind a wall, then any tool is not going to be able to actually go through and look at that data, use that as part of its reasoning, see it, and use it to create an answer to a query. And so that really is one of the huge limitations that exists. Even in places where we have some data, right? One of the other challenges is that a lot of the programs that utilities use are proprietary. And so intervenors most of the time do not actually have the funds to get licenses and access to a lot of these systems. And so that's one of the other huge limitations, even for the model of intervention that exists right now, without trying to use AI to aid it. And of course, all of this is incredibly important because we know, and there are lots of studies and papers that demonstrate that wide-scale participation in these processes really is the fundamental basis for energy justice and energy democracy. And so we feel it's incredibly important that we find a way really to bring people into this discussion who have not previously been a part of it. And to Joel's point on the challenges around data and how we could actually think about that. We have another paper that is currently in preprint form. I will put the link to that in the comment as well. That really gets into a lot of the confidentiality aspects and why or how we actually need to change the way that data is available in order to bring the promise that we put forward in artificial intelligence and energy democracy really to light, and to where it can actually be used in the way that we're envisioning in this paper, recognizing that, yes, the modeling is only going to work as we envision if we can actually get the data that's behind it. Do you want to add more on that, Joel?
Yeah, I want to make another observation here that we think it's extremely important that AI be conceptualized as a tool of advancing energy democracy. But there's another subtle observation that we make in the paper that I'd like to make sure everybody understands here. We see a lot in the press about data centers and the expected growth, and the report that Heather mentioned yesterday from Bloomberg saying, "Wow, the problem's going to be even worse than we thought it was going to be. It's going to be 36% worse than we thought it was going to be." For many, many years, the electric grid demand on the electric grid was relatively stagnant. And it's really the growth of data centers that has sparked this conversation about having more electricity on the grid to meet this demand. Now, we can argue until the cows come home about whether the expected demand from the increase of data centers is actually a thing, whether we're in an AI bubble or not, whether some of these data centers are actually going to be around at the end of their useful life. And we can argue, we can have that conversation for a very long time. But even if you took it at faith that data centers are going to require a lot more electricity, if you had empowered intervenors in Public Utility Commission proceedings, they might be able to propose different ways of meeting that demand, different ways of meeting that demand than simply just building the next power plant. And we have spent a lot of time in the paper talking about the biases that utilities have when it comes to building infrastructure. And again, I mentioned earlier that they make more profit out of building infrastructure than they would out of selling software. But the the idea of empowering people to see these proceedings and to be able to visualize the assumptions behind the utilities models, the way it works in different jurisdictions, the alternatives that might exist to building a new power plant, not only empowers people to be part of these proceedings in a way we really haven't seen until now, but also has the real potential to change how this conversation about how we think about meeting the demand from data centers. And I think that's a lot of people just take it for granted that we're going to have to build more power plants very quickly and restart nuclear power plants and have new ones in order to meet data center demand. But the reality is that the grid ecosystem, the Public Utility Commission proceeding ecosystem, is basically a closed loop right now. That mostly what you have is utilities walking in and saying, we need to build this, we need to have 12, and again, I recognize this works differently in Texas, but we need to build this, we need to have a 12% rate increase because we're building this. And there isn't that voice, that empowered voice on the other side to say no, that it really could be done a different way. Right? I mean, the elephant in the room, obviously, is that this takes money, and this takes training, and this takes time, and this takes having a model that would be sophisticated enough to do all the things that we suggest that it could do. Now, like all good law professors, we don't have an answer to that. We're not advocating that federal or state funding be made available tomorrow for this specific purpose. But what we have done is we've identified programs. Heather mentioned the intervenor compensation programs. There are already programs on the books in about 15 states that compensate people, albeit at a relatively low level, for the time and effort that they put into being intervenors in Public Utility Commission proceedings. Let me just be clear about something. When you are an intervenor in a commission proceeding, you're there for the duration. You are a party. You are a participant in the proceeding. And in fact, that's something that we found appealing about this, that you could have a seat at the table and AI could help you have a better seat at the table. I still get messages now, 4 years later, from a proceeding that I was part of 4 years ago at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And it would be just absolutely overwhelming for an individual or group of individuals not skilled in this to take part in this without some help. And so we've envisioned that the intervenor compensation laws and programs could be retooled where they exist to try to help people use AI to productive benefit on the grid. We are very aware. We've gotten this question every time we have presented this paper. We are very aware that this is not something that would happen overnight. This is not when people get past the idea that what we're not talking about here is finding some way to have more renewable energy to meet the demand growth from data centers, people then say to us, well, how's this going to work? And I think we've done as much as we can do in one law review article to illustrate how this can work. We decided to put off most issues about data availability to this new project that Heather has put the link on there. And there we have argued that virtually all data that is generated in these proceedings should be made available to the public. But the challenges of training a model to do everything that we're talking about here, we understand are going to be substantial.
And I think that we've talked about rate cases a lot, but obviously rate cases are not the only place that we envision this being really useful. So things like performance-based regulation, which many states are moving to really in an attempt to break the tie between utilities' desire to only have capital improvements or capital expenditures versus doing more things like virtual power plants. So obviously there's going to be something that that's going to be different. And so that's another place where we really see potentially this being useful. And then in states that have integrated resource planning, as Joel mentioned, in most IRPs, there's going to be one and only one thing that the utilities want to do, and it's what they put forward. And so if this is a tool that makes it so that others can bring different viewpoints to regulators in those proceedings, we think that's going to be really a very significant place for these models to exist as well. The other thing that we do think it could really be beneficial for is providing a different viewpoint around the social aspects of what utilities are doing. So even when you are trying to understand things like disconnects, utilities in many states do not actually make their disconnect numbers publicly available. And really having the ability to understand more fully something like what is happening across an entire customer base, we think could be very beneficial for regulators when they are looking at actions that a utility is thinking about taking. So there's the other side of it that we discuss in the paper, really more specifically around providing a societal benefit more generally that doesn't necessarily only correspond to things like a capital build-out program. So it really, the paper goes into a number of different places where we think having the tools of artificial intelligence available to intervenors could really provide a very significant benefit to ratepayers and the general public.
I conducted a thought experiment just now to verify what Heather's been saying. I went to the website of the Virginia State Corporation Commission, and I went there as if I was a law student who was just learning energy law from one of the two of us for the first time. And I went to the energy regulation section of that website. And one thing that appears there is a docket number, and you would have to know that it was a docket number, but you could guess, you could click on a link there. And it is a technical conference that the Corporation Commission is hosting this month to talk about what the commission should do about the increase in load growth, demand growth coming from data centers. And presumably, it says here, any member of the public can take part in it in this conference. I think Heather and I would think that that would be an extraordinarily difficult undertaking for someone who's not overly familiar with energy regulation. But if you had AI to help you here, this is the kind of thing where the kind of policy making that a commission is doing, thinking about what to do next. It's not actions in any given proceeding. Thinking about what to do next, that AI could be extremely beneficial there as well. And uh, you don't know what you don't know. And it seems to me at times that we have conceptualized AI as either bad or just somewhat good. That there are some things that it can do well. I read things all the time about how it's going to empower university students to write papers that are undetectable by their professors, and how it's going to help you do your holiday shopping and this sort of thing. And I just want to say before we go into the Q&A here that we undertook this project with a spirit of trying to figure out not every place where AI could do good on the grid, but this one very important way that it could empower individuals to deal with the asymmetries that they face if they want to be involved in commission proceedings. And I just want to say, I mean, there are plenty of other places where AI can do good on the grid. One of the examples we use is that if the California utilities had AI, they might have been able to do a better job of avoiding some of the devastating wildfires that they've faced in recent years. But that's for them. And a lot of what we saw when we were looking at this was AI by them for them, which just exacerbates this asymmetry of resources that we have when we're dealing with proceedings. So I just want to say that I think what we're trying to do here is conceptualize a way of leveling the playing field. And it's not perfect. In other words, we don't have a perfectly developed model for this. We actually toyed with the idea of trying to build a model ourselves before we before we did this, and then we realized we didn't have an individual proceeding in mind, and we ourselves didn't have the resources to do it. But certainly, we do believe very fundamentally in this concept that it does have the ability to be beneficial. And there are some law professors who are actually saying that in the right hands, AI can be beneficial for certain purposes. And I think we're finding ourselves in that camp, at least when it comes to this. I guess with that, we're happy to take any questions that you might have. I've got the chat. We both have the chat open, so if you want to put something in the chat for us, we're happy to see it there. Dr. Hassan is also fielding some questions as well.
Thank you so much for this interesting talk. So please, I got some questions that are direct to me, but I will read for you. But if you have more questions, please ask in the Q&A bottom, so we all three of us can see them. So the first question that I got is saying who should be responsible for validating and auditing the AI tools that citizen inventors rely on. So what sort of the agency or who would be responsible for that, based on your like perspective?
I think in the first instance, uh, we did not envision that there would be some sort of central gatekeeper that would be responsible for this, that individuals could develop this on their own. And what the question really seems to be getting at for me is what sort of limitations should there be when the model attempts to access data that's part of a proceeding? We don't envision at all that there should be fixed limitations on who should develop the model and what sort of model it should be. In fact, we're perfectly happy to have different entities compete to try to have the best one. The reality, of course, is that we do think that it's going to be at first the larger organizations like environmental groups that have been consistent intervenors in proceedings that might have the resources to do this. So to the extent that there's going to be someone responsible for testing and validating models, it's more likely to be them in the near term. But one thing I do want to make sure to reiterate, and both of us have said this, is that the the utilities themselves have models. They're using AI to model the impact of, let's say, building a new power plant and using that to meet new demand. In order for we'll call it citizen model, to have any kind of chance of being successful, it has to have access to the assumptions undergirding, we'll call it the utility model. And that I think is an important feature of what we're looking for here.
And I just to add one more thing onto that, I think that, it's becoming very clear in the legal realm that any output needs to have some sort of verification from the person who's using it. And so I think that to Joel's point, we don't necessarily view that as coming from a regulator or from some other entity. There's going to have to be some amount of self-verification that occurs, just like with any model that exists today.
Great, thank you. Just before going further to the discussion, I hope you see the CLE credit because I shared the screen. Okay, so another question is was my question as well, that when I was reading the article, this is the balancing between privacy and transparency. So the question said that how should the data privacy, security, and confidentiality concerns somehow could be balanced with the goal of transparent and public engagement?
Well, first of all, I'll just say that a lot of this is explored in much more depth in the second paper that we have here. That we made a fundamental choice. It's a wonderful question, and thank you so much for posing it. We made a fundamental choice at the beginning of this project that we would not be able to handle all of the possible issues with data availability and all of the possible issues with what possible ideas about what AI could do for us on the grid in one law review article that spanned 25,000 or so words. It's not something that's possible, and maybe we ought to just write a book about it. Uh, we start both here in the paper and in the subsequent one on energy data justice from a basic proposition, and that is that utilities have been using the ideas of privacy and trade secrets and confidentiality to hide more data from us than they should be able to. And that is our starting point, and that means that there should be a thumb on the scale for making data much more broadly available to us than it actually has been so far, and that commissions have the responsibility to judge questions of privacy and confidentiality, but they too should have a thumb on the scale for making the data more broadly available to us. And there are certainly legitimate concerns about security and about privacy, but we think those can be handled in novel and creative ways. Just to give you an example, one thing that we've proposed in the data article is that data that involves uh, personal identifiable information, how you use electricity, could be handled through an intermediary like a data trust to handle that and to make that data available to intervenors or to companies that might want to make beneficial use of it on the grid. So I guess what we want to say here is we don't want these concerns to be the enemy of progress as they have been in the past, and to actually do better. We said this to 8 public utility commissioners in this webinar, and the trend is clearly moving in that direction. There are a number of states, Colorado and New Jersey are the ones that come to mind, that are taking steps to say to their utilities, you can't hide data anymore, and you need it to be much more broadly available in formats that people other than you can use it uh, than you have before. And commissioners are becoming aware of this, and they're sharing knowledge about this with one another. And it's truly a trend that we see continuing.
Thank you so much. Another question I got is more related to justice, which is talking about how can under-resourced communities or marginalized groups realistically adopt and somehow can use AI tools without widening participation gaps. So basically, what's your suggestion? What other, for example, available tools for the communities that may not have sufficient skills or resources to use these AI tools?
Well, so I think that, one of the things that we envisioned is that for underrepresented groups, right, there is not the financial capacity to actually hire an energy attorney to participate in these kinds of proceedings and put forward their viewpoints, their concerns, what they think should be considered. And we actually were very hopeful as we were going through this project that actually having an AI model that could help that attorney would really substantially decrease the amount of time that the attorney would need to put into representing an under-resourced group in a docket proceeding. And so perhaps with this tool available, that attorney might be willing to do that representation, for example, pro bono, or for a very, very, very reduced fee, because the model enables them to get up to speed so much faster, to really be able to understand the different levers that could be used to make the points that they need to for that energy justice group in a way that is not available now. So we're actually quite hopeful that a tool like this would enable underrepresented groups to have more voice in these proceedings than they currently do today.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's the last question I got, and I don't see any question from the AN Q&A. So the question said, how can how can we overcome the institutional or political resistance that may block AI adaptation for this purpose? I think it's more political.
Wow. I think we're going to have, how much time do we have left?
Quite, quite
This
broad,
one's,
yes. You have 5 minutes, but who knows?
5 minutes. Okay, well, this one's going to take 50 minutes, so we'll see what we can do with this. I have
Actually,
a
of that
number of
time.
thoughts. I have a number of thoughts about this one right off the bat, and I'm sure Heather will have as many as I do. Uh, One thing that we identified in the paper, and we've talked about a number of times, that's particularly challenging here, is this idea in the grid that somehow utilities think that AI is just about them. It's just about their operational improvements and finding better ways to disconnect their customers and that sort of idea. How you overcome that idea, I think, requires a commission with a more progressive bent that is aware of and attuned to the kinds of issues that we raise here. And we simply say, look, AI can be used for different purposes. It's also going to require, in some instances, some sort of self-help that people who are on the ground are going to have to figure out how to do this and then bring this full blown to a proceeding and say, we want to be part of this proceeding. We want to be part of this proceeding. We want to take part in this proceeding. We want to evaluate all the utilities assumptions and so forth. And it's going to take somebody with enough gumption to come forward and say, we need to do this. One other thing that's occurred to me as we've been talking about this is that there are certainly going to be creative ways to fund the development of a model. This is an ideal thing for a foundation grant. This is the this is something that's certainly in the current political environment, not necessarily something that federal and state governments would do. The But there are outside sources of funding for this kind of purpose that might work on a very discrete level. Try one model in one state, in one proceeding, and see what happens. The question that's posed here is a wonderful question, but I just want to say that all of the obstacles doing this are not going to be overcome in one fell swoop. And I think it's going to take a considerable amount of experimentation here before this happens. Uh, We're always in this position in writing law scholarship. We're always saying, look, this is something new. This is something that people should try. And if you don't have that sort of ambition, I don't. I'm not able to answer. I wouldn't be able to answer that. If we didn't have that sort of ambition, we wouldn't be able to answer that question.
I think the short answer is there's going to be 50 different answers to that particular question because there's going to be 50 different paths that the states are just going to each have to have a slightly different path to get to where this is useful. But it all does, as Joel has mentioned, it all comes down to regulators. And as with everything in the energy sphere, we're going to have some regulators and some regulatory bodies that move faster, and we're going to have some that move a little bit more slowly. But hopefully we move generally to where customers really do have more of a voice in our energy system. Hopefully that's where we'll get to.
And I just have one last observation on that point. This is a business that works on very long time scales. Power plants are built to last decades. Transmission lines are built to last decades. We think that this is the sort of innovation that over a long time span can change the way that people take part in these proceedings. This is not the kind of thing that's going to happen overnight. As Heather said, it might be 50 different attempts before something succeeds and before this becomes a more regularized sort of part of the process.
Thank you so much. We have one question, but I don't know. Like you said, I believe uh, our time's finished. But I will pass you in email to answer one of our audience. So thank you so much for great discussion, and thank you so much for your time and talking about this very timely topic. And thank you so much for the audience. And please follow us. And next year in January, Professor Gabriel Eckstein will be um, our guest and talk about geothermal energy. So thank you so much for everyone, and hope you have a wonderful and relaxing evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Take care.